Hello and welcome to the Social Mobility Commission's State of the Nation 2023 online event. We've got a packed agenda for you today, so I'm delighted that we're joined by colleagues from the Commission and also the Secretariat to talk about our State of the Nation report that we launched on the 12th of September. I'm just going to do a bit of housekeeping. So I'm Paula Kemp, I'm Head of Employer Engagement here at the Commission. And if I could ask that you all remain on mute, please use the Q&A function throughout the session to ask any questions of us. We have actually disabled the chat function, so any questions you've got, if you could target them through the Q&A session. As previously mentioned, this webinar will be recorded, and if anybody needs them, closed captions are available. If you are looking for the agenda, here it is. So as I've said, here's my welcome, and then we'll go to the introduction from our chair, Alun Francis, and then we'll be looking at our State of the Nation highlights and our Data Explorer tool that we launched alongside our State of the Nation report. And then Alun will come back in and talk about some of the next steps for the Social Mobility Commission and what the report means for us and our future work. And then we'll open it up to the questions that you ask, so please do feel free to ask those questions. So I'm going to introduce Alun, who's going to take us through sort of the, an overview of what's been happening here at the Commission for the last year and as part of this report. So Alun is our chair of the Commission, been with us since late 2021. And he's also the principal and chief executive of Blackpool and the Fylde College, which is an award-winning college organisation, the largest and highest performance further education college in the country, and it sits at the heart of local regeneration plans up there in Blackpool. So Alun, if you'd like to go ahead and fill us in with what's been happening.
Thank you very much, Paula, and a very warm welcome to everybody. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. It's fantastic to have so many people interested in exploring social mobility and at least finding out more about it, hopefully through the information that we've collected in our report. So I'm particularly proud of this year's report. Our priority is to improve social mobility, and we want to make sure that initiatives are targeted at the right people and wherever possible based on effective evidence-based practice. And the starting point of that has to be that we have high quality information that allows us to have a really clear view of what social mobility patterns are. So as you will see in this report, we've collated a wealth of data that illustrates the successes and the challenges for social mobility in the country. If I take you through very briefly some of the key findings, I think that might be helpful, and then others are going to take you through that in more detail. But as we reported last year, the evidence in terms of social mobility trends is not as gloomy as some of the popular policy narratives suggest, especially when we look at mobility over the long term. Occupational mobility, this is only one measure, but it's a very important one, does not seem to have been in decline and may have slightly improved. Education mobility has improved in the sense that far more people have been able to go on to degree or degree level qualifications in university or other routes to university, even when their parents did not. However, whilst there are some great successes, we should not ignore the fact that there is room for improvement on social mobility outcomes. We've only just scratched the surface into understanding the links between social mobility, people and places. So I wanted to outline just a few of the key innovative findings that are contained in the report this year. The first, I think, is a very important point, which is the way in which we've tried to look at social and economic background. So one of the interesting things we've done this year is to group the jobs that people are currently doing and their occupational background into 5 categories or quintiles, rather than the previous 3-class division. So we now talk about higher and lower professional jobs, intermediate and higher and lower working class jobs. When we use those phrases, we don't mean any moral judgment about them. They're just the categories that are widely used in the official statistics. And we could go up to 7 categories, but at the present time, 5 is more manageable. And this promises to open up a much more nuanced understanding of social mobility than we've had in the past. So, for instance, it shows significantly weaker outcomes for those in the bottom quintile, what are referred to as the lower working class, in comparison with the higher working class. An example would be 21% of lower working class young people are not in employment educational training, often known as NEET. And that is significantly higher than any of the other socioeconomic groups. We've also found that adults with lower working class parents are about 3 times as likely to be in a working class occupation themselves compared with adults with higher professional parents. And in education, people whose parents had degrees are still far more likely, 64% versus 18%, to get a degree than those whose parents had no qualifications. I think the important point to make here is that by breaking out the data into quintiles, we start to get a clearer view of those who experience the most acute disadvantages, and we start to get a much clearer view of the spectrum of opportunity across different social groups, rather than a binary view that tends to just group people into 2 very crudely defined groups. So it's a much more sophisticated basis for looking at social mobility. The second really important part of our report this year is that our regional analysis shows differences in both mobility and opportunity across the country. It should be a cause of concern that social mobility outcomes don't just depend on who your parents are, or your educational outcome, or your skills, all of which are important, but it's also very strongly correlated with where you grow up. The data shows why it's just as important to look within those areas as it is between them. And again, despite the popular narrative, there isn't a clear-cut north-south divide, nor is there a case of London versus the rest of the UK. The picture is far more nuanced than that, although there are clearly geographical aspects to social mobility which we need to take seriously. For example, someone growing up in London and adjoining areas is more likely to attain high qualifications, higher earnings, and a higher occupational level than someone from the same socioeconomic background growing up, for example, in a more rural or remote area. This trend continues when looking at an individual's educational journey. The highest proportion of students that are eligible for free school meals, as well as achieving a high level of achievement, are located in London. Yet for the same person, there is also a greater risk of unemployment, of economic inactivity, and lower working class employment is also higher in London. So it's not necessarily the case that all the advantage stacks up in one place over another. Each area has its own distinct social mobility story to tell. And this really highlights the importance of looking between regions as well as within them and trying to understand the place-based aspects of social mobility more forensically. The third aspect of our report relates to differences in terms of ethnicity. There are some striking differences when it comes to understanding the outcomes across different ethnic groups too. And what is also interesting is looking at the development of these outcomes over time. So a good way to illustrate this example is the interlink between educational attainment, that's how well an individual will perform at school or the chances of attending university, and their future employment prospects. So our data shows that an individual from a Chinese, Indian, or Black African group is generally doing much better in education than those with origins that are Black Caribbean or white British, even though those people are from the same socio-economic backgrounds. And this trend continues into post-compulsory schooling into university. So people from Chinese, Indian, and Black African ethnic groups are more likely to obtain degrees than white British or Black Caribbean people from the same social economic background. These differences are quite important. It's also important to note that when these individuals enter the workforce, the trend flips. So several ethnic minority groups, Black Caribbean, Black African, mixed, Pakistani, and Indian, are more likely to be unemployed than white British young people from the same socioeconomic background. And this shows that success in education does not always translate immediately into success in the workplace. Finally, we also consider gender. So a similar nuanced phenomenon is observed when we compare the outcomes across men and women. Our data reveals that across all socioeconomic background brackets measured, women tend to do better than men when it comes to educational attainment across their schooling journey. So that's ages 5 to 16. And more women are likely to get a high qualification and attend university. However, once again, when it comes to the workplace, this gap reverses, with women in the same socioeconomic background earning less than men and being less likely to be in a higher professional job. Again, this shows that success in education does not always translate into success in the workplace. And there are also differences, very importantly, in terms of disability. So when we look at the data around disability, our analysis shows that people with a disability do significantly worse across all outcomes. In some cases, the gap is even wider amongst those from lower working class backgrounds compared to others, suggesting that professional families are perhaps better able to mitigate the effect of disability on young people's life chances. This is an area worth real further consideration. So, without getting into all the details, one of the conclusions that we would draw from this collection of data is that we do really need to take into account the interplay between these different, the way that social mobility affects different groups of people in different places quite seriously. And alongside our report, we're very proud to be launching our Data Explorer tool, which we will demonstrate for you shortly. Very briefly, we think this is a unique way of presenting the data around social mobility, which allows you as users to access an interactive online tool to understand the specific social mobility challenges in particular areas. And we think this helps to support the development of place-based initiatives to tackle those challenges. We would like this to become a game changer for understanding social mobility in the UK, and we'd like you all to become familiar with it, to use it, and help us improve it over time, so that this becomes a really useful way of helping to get inside the data and understand what the different solutions might be in different places. So it follows clearly, if the patterns of mobility are different in different places, the answers to how mobility is improved in those places is going to be different. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Michael from our team, who is going to help take you through the highlights of the State of the Nation report in some more detail. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks very much, Alan, and thanks to everybody for coming along. Okay, I'm going to try and keep this as brief as I can, although the report is very comprehensive, so I'm just going to give a flavour of what we found, and then please do keep with the typing of the questions. Always good to have those. So let's start by looking at an overview of the index, so that it's then sort of easier to understand the detail. This is something that we introduced last year, and the first thing to say about it is we're looking at several different outcomes, so not just occupational mobility. We are also looking at, where we can, income, wealth, housing, and education. So we're trying to take a really rounded view of mobility, not as The Guardian would have it, because we're trying to redefine mobility, but simply because things like education and income matter to people. So we think it's important to look at all of those things together alongside occupation. We're taking a life course approach to our index. So we look at people at different stages of their life. Starting at the top, we've got what we call mobility outcomes, and these are people who are perhaps 40 or 50 years old, and we look at the comparison between where they are now, whether that's in income, occupation, or whatever it is, and where they started off, so what the position that their parents were in, where they were as children, and those are full mobility outcomes. Now, that's something that you really need to include, because that's the true picture of social mobility. That's where people started versus where they ended up. But it is necessarily really backwards looking, Now, if you've got a 50-year-old person and you're interested in, what their life was like when they were a child, or you're having to wind the clock back 40 years. So we might be thinking about perhaps education policy 40 years ago. So very, very backwards looking, although of course we do need to have it. So we supplement that with what we call intermediate outcomes. And these are outcomes for people earlier in life. So they're intermediate in the sense that people are perhaps 20 or 30 years old, or teenagers in some cases when we're looking at outcomes at school. And we're trying to compare those early life outcomes with how people started off, their position of their parents. And also those intermediate outcomes can be very helpful in predicting future life outcomes, because if you're doing well at 20 or 30, the likelihood is you're going to be doing well later in life as well. And then finally, we try and take a forward look by examining the drivers of social mobility. So these are things that can enable social mobility or can get in the way. They're not mobility measures themselves, but they could be predictive of social mobility. So that's things like conditions of childhood, like child poverty, educational opportunities, like the quality of the UK's education system. So things like that. I also just want to reinforce what Alan said earlier, which is we're using a 5-part division of socioeconomic background for most of the index. The old system used just professional, intermediate, and working class. We've now divided professional into higher and lower, and we've also divided working class into higher and lower. So that just gives us a bit better resolution on all of these things. Okay, so with that introduction out of the way, what are some of the trends we've found? So in the next section, I will show you that. Again, can't be comprehensive here. These are really just a few examples. And I've got to stress, out of all of those 5 outcomes I mentioned, so occupation, income, and so on, we're just looking at occupational mobility in this example here. And that's the one where we've got perhaps the best quality data and going back the furthest in time. Along the x-axis here, we've got birth cohort, so when the people were born. And up the y-axis, we've got occupational mobility rate. So that top line there that's hovering around about 60%, that's the total occupational mobility rate. So that's the total proportion of people who are in a different occupational class from their parents. So your parents professional, you're working class, or your parents working class, you're professional. All of those would go into that grey line. And then we've split it up into upwards and downwards below. So the blue line would be moving upwards, the red line would be moving downwards. And you can see there's just a remarkable stability here. So going back over 100 years, if we're looking at birth cohorts, that total occupational mobility rate has actually been about the same in the UK. The composition has changed a little bit. Now, there used to be, in the so-called golden age of social mobility after the Second World War, a lot more upwards and not so much downwards. Now it's equalizing a bit because we're not having the same expansion in the professional sector of the labour market. So, without that expansion, you can't have people moving upwards without people also moving downwards. So yes, changing labour market structure reflected there. There's no evidence that that shrinking surplus is because it's become more difficult for working class people to move upwards. On the contrary, if we're thinking about relative mobility, it's been very stable and may even have improved slightly. Okay, so let's look at another aspect of mobility. This is housing. Now, the way we've examined this is to look at owning one's home versus renting one's home. On the left, we've got a relative mobility measure. So that's how good a predictor is parental home ownership of children's home ownership, or like how much does the parental home ownership tell you about whether the children are going to own their own home or not. And here, well, unfortunately, it is a bit of bad news in that relative housing mobility has worsened, and that's that rising line. The rising line is actually a worsening, because it means that parental home ownership has become a better predictor of children's home ownership than it was in '91. Over on the right, we've got a comparison between men and women. So men, the pair of lines on the left, women, the pair of lines on the right, and the blue line were parental renters, and the red line are parents who own their home. And you can see for both parents who are renters and parents who are owners, men are more likely to own their home than are women. Okay, so much for sort of quick examples of mobility trends. If we now have a look at a quick example of the geographical findings, well, what we have here are the chances of getting a professional job by region, and we have controlled for socioeconomic background. So what we're saying is here, if you were to compare two people of the same socioeconomic background, where would those two people have better and worse chances of getting a professional job? And you can see it's not really just a simple case of, you know, there's an economic center where chances are great, and then radiating outwards from that, it just gets worse and worse. That's actually not quite what the geographical analysis shows. Chances are good in and around London, the blue, big sort of massive blue you can see in the southeast there, but they're also good around Manchester. So that's Greater Manchester, Merseyside and Cheshire there, and also the area around Edinburgh, that's East Scotland, the other blue area there. So it's not just that, you know, London's the only place where you've got good chances of doing this. Although if you narrow it down to just look at people who have working class origins, so we'd be looking there at long up mobility, their chances of long up mobility are actually best in outer London and also Surrey and Sussex. All right, now Alan mentioned that apart from the geographical breakdowns, we've got breakdowns by protected characteristics. So let's just take a look at a few of those, and we'll start off with looking at men's and women's occupational mobility chances. And what we find here is, well, we've got the 5 socioeconomic backgrounds that we touched on. Over on the left there, we've got men and women from a lower working class background. So in other words, their parents had a lower working class job. Over on the right, we've got men and women from a higher professional background. So their parents had a higher professional job. And as you might expect, when you come from a higher professional background, you're more likely to end up in a high professional or any professional job yourself, and that's that sort of blue zone is much bigger in those, and that pair of bars all the way over on the right. You can also see that for any socioeconomic background, men's chances of being in a professional job are higher than women's chances. So let's just look at lower working, for example. You've got 14 and 20% of men going into higher and lower professional respectively. And then also over on the left next to that, you've got 8 and 23% of women going into higher and lower professional. So sort of from all 5 backgrounds, men do have higher chances of getting into a professional job. Okay, well, along similar lines, I guess, we can see we've got a breakdown here by ethnic background and also by socioeconomic background. Now, the blue is people from a lower working background. The red is people from higher professional background. And we've also got the breakdown by ethnicity. You can see that people who are of a Chinese, Indian, Black African, or Bangladeshi or Pakistani background are more likely to get degrees than white people from the same background. So let's just look at the red bars. Chinese on 92%, so that's Chinese ethnic background people from a higher professional socioeconomic background versus white British, which is 62%. And similarly, if we're just considering people with lower working class parents, Chinese is 59% getting degrees, white British is 18% getting degrees. If we move on to look at access to professional jobs, this is where we sort of see, I guess, a similar story as what we saw with men and women. While many ethnicities are doing better at getting degrees than white British, they're not doing so much better at getting into professional jobs. Now, people from a Chinese and Indian ethnic background, yes, they are doing better than white British at access to professional jobs, but that's not the case with some of the other ethnicities. if we have a look at Pakistani young people, we can see that they're actually less likely to get into a professional job. The red bar there is 48% versus 59% for white British. So that's quite an odd situation in a way, because Pakistani young people, they're more likely to have a degree than white British, but they're less likely to be in a professional job. Sort of a similar position with men and women, where women are more likely to have a degree, but they're less likely to be in a professional job. So definitely something quite strange going on there. Finally, I'd like to have a look at the interaction of disability and socioeconomic background. And I call it an interaction because, well, we can see two things here. Well, first of all, when you're disabled, so that's the people in the red bars, you are less likely to be economically active. So that's either in work or looking for work. Quite a bit less likely than people who are not disabled. So that's one thing. But there's more to this, because you can see that the gap between blue and red, so that's between non-disabled and disabled, that gap is much bigger among the lower working group than among the higher professional group. So there's some kind of interaction going on here, such that when people come from a higher professional background, the disability status seems to make less difference to the chances of economic activity than it does when you're from a lower working background. So there's something going on there where that higher professional background sort of helps to cancel out or partially mitigate the effect of the disability. And that's why we would say there's an interaction. Okay, well, this has been a really quick flavor of the findings. It's far from comprehensive. And to get that comprehensive look, we'll want to be taking a look at the Data Explorer tool, which colleagues are now going to demonstrate.
Great, thanks, Michael. So as Michael and Alan mentioned, new this year is our Data Explorer tool, and my colleague Rosa and I are going to introduce this to you now. Great, so where did the idea for this interactive tool come from? So with our new index, as Michael has just run through, we had improvements in the way we measure social mobility. And with that, we also wanted improvements in the presentation of our findings. And we therefore set out to design a much more dynamic and engaging way for audiences to understand social mobility with the Data Explorer tool. And that's what we'll show you here today. So inspiration for this project was derived from the Opportunity Atlas, which is shown here. And this is a sophisticated social mobility tool developed by the American economist Raj Chetty. And the Opportunity Atlas provides detailed information on economic inequality and mobility across the United States, and a way for regions and neighborhoods to understand their own specific issues. But to our knowledge, nothing similar to this tool existed for the UK. And this really provided a strong impetus for developing something similar here. So we set off to develop a Data Explorer tool with our colleagues on the digital team in the Equalities Hub to simplify and translate the findings from our State of the Nation report. Next slide, please. So what does the tool do? Well, just to provide you a very kind of cursory overview of what this tool is meant to do. The Data Explorer tool is a collection of interactive maps, charts, and commentary that show social mobility measures across the UK, broken down by geographical regions and protected characteristics. The tool presents the data in the underlying data in a much more accessible way. So instead of having to comb through a 250-page report, the idea behind the tool was really to provide a quick and easy way for people to access the findings and insights that meet their individual needs and interests. And this really serves as a direct complement to our State of the Nation report. And we hope that it helps to bring the findings from the report to life. And we view it as a first step in moving from an explanatory to exploratory product to help the SMC to fulfill its remit to monitor social mobility across the UK. And it is our hope that we can continue to build this tool year on year to provide the best available evidence that we can, and ultimately to help create better policies and interventions that promote greater opportunity for all. So I'll now hand over to Rosa, who will walk you through the demonstration of our tool.
Thank you, Jackie. Well, in the next few minutes, I'm going to run you through the very quick demo of the tool so you can get an idea of what the tool looks like and its key functionalities. So in this slide, you can see the home page, the landing page of the tool. On the image of the left, you can see a top navigation bar that follows the structure of the social mobility index that Michael presented, where we categorize the data in mobility outcomes, intermediate outcomes, and drivers. As we mentioned, we also included a focus on regional data, and this is captured by the tool as well. You can access this regional data by clicking on the social mobility by area tab on the top, or you can also type your region of interest into the search engine on the find data by region, as you can see in the image on the right. Next slide, please. So if you click into one of the domains, for example, intermediate outcomes, you will find a drop-down menu on the left with access of all the range of indicators that is under that domain. Let's say that in this domain, we select the indicator of economic activity. In this one, on the top part, you will find a table of contents that include like the summary findings and all the breakdowns available for this indicator. Then if let's say we are interested in ethnicity, we would see a chart like this. For each visualization, there are 3 tabs. The first one, which is what we are seeing right now, would be like the chart in itself. Then you would find a second tab, which would provide you the data of the chart in a data table format. And finally, the third tab, which is download, which like give you to few links to download or the image or the data set of the chart. You can also explore additional features of these charts, by, for example, enabling confident intervals and filtering the data series in the chart. Next slide, please. So for both intermediate and drivers, we have developed what we call composite indices, which are featured at the top of the left side navigation menu. These indices combine several indicators into one score to give a more reliable picture of geographical mobility patterns. So for each of these composite indices, we begin with a description of what the index measured. And then just below, you see an interactive map where you can zoom in and out, click on the region, and some more information will appear, and also the chart, an interactive chart. And just below, there are the summary of the key findings and some more information about how we have developed this composite index. Finally, I want to show you the social mobility by area, which is probably the most innovative and unique part of this tool. So basically, this section focuses on understanding how a particular region performs across several dimensions of social mobility covered by our 5 composite indices, which are listed in the screen. So you can search your area of interest, again, using the searching engine. In this case, you'll find it in the left. And let's see, for example, Inner London West. As you can see in the bars for each of the composite indices, we can interpret that this region excels in promising prospects, sociocultural advantage, and research development. We can see, like, for the 3 of them, they are in quintile 5, in the highest in blue. But then we see that this region faces challenges in precarious situation and childhood poverty, as they are located in the red part of the bar. Well, that was a very quick overview, but I encourage you to have a look and explore by yourself. And please let us know if you have any question or feedback, as this is the first iteration. And I'll pass it now over Alan to continue. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rosa. I've noticed already from the questions some really fantastic questions developing, and around some of the methodology, some of the definitions and so on. We'll come back to those a little later. What we'd just like to brief you on now is where we're planning to kind of go next. So as I'm sure you'll agree, the findings that were outlined are quite striking. I think it's fair to say many of you will probably be wondering how to make sense of them. And we've been faced with the same dilemma. It's quite a complex picture, and how do you start to draw this together? Now, there's a role, I think, for everyone in addressing these challenges, including government policymakers, employers, schools, universities, colleges, local communities, and individuals themselves and families. And we've tried to kind of draw out where we think the major focus of our priorities will be going forward in terms of thinking about where interventions to improve social mobility might best be directed. So at the moment, we've grouped them into kind of 4 themes. So the first of these is really about growing opportunities. So one of the questions that has been asked is the difference between absolute and relative social mobility. And of course, relative social mobility is when you compare one social group to another and compare their outcomes. Absolute is when you start to measure the change for one group over time. And they're both quite important, although we would argue that in the debates about policy, relative mobility, the comparison of groups, has tended to dominate. But actually, some of the evidence is that absolute mobility is just as important. And the danger, of course, of focusing just on comparison between 2 groups is you don't then focus on, well, actually, are those at the bottom moving up? Or is it just a proportion of those from the bottom? What's happening in that respect? And when we look at some of the data around, for example, income over a period of time, it suggests that we've got some challenges around that being somewhat sticky. So we are also concerned in terms of occupations, and particularly higher paying occupations, that it's very important that we have a positive growing supply of those opportunities. So one key theme in our work going forward will be about how can we harness the power of innovation to increase opportunities in local areas, particularly for people from disadvantaged backgrounds. But it's clear that actually those local patterns are complex. So it's actually about opportunity for everybody, and particularly to ensure that people don't always have to leave the area they've grown up if they want to seek an occupation that's satisfying and well paid for them. It's also important that areas have a mix of those occupations, so that, you know, the more higher level occupations you have, the more things those people buy, other people can benefit from that in other ways. And so that whole idea of growing opportunities is quite important to us. The second is a focus really on the more traditional areas around nurturing talent, and we've used that umbrella term, and that would cover things like early years and education. So really, I would think in this context of kind of provision up to 16, there was a wealth of evidence on the importance of early years in terms of developing cognitive and non-cognitive skills. So it's very important that we have a focus on early years, and again, part of that is about closing gaps between groups, but some of it is also about, are we raising the levels of those at the bottom in terms of their cognitive and non-cognitive skills, because they're so important in shaping their future life chances. That runs through the period from early years right the way through primary and secondary school, because it's so important. We also know, by the way, that there is a tale of young people who come out at 16 with very low literacy and numeracy, who really are not doing well, not just in terms of conventional educational achievement, but in terms of having some of the basic skills required to do well, no matter what occupation they go into. And that has to be a cause for concern for us. So the third theme then is when we get to 16, some people this is 18, but when you start to enter the labour market, so what's the process through which people we distribute skills and talent and develop that in post 16. So that raises some of the questions that people have asked in the questions about higher skills. We tend to have a lot of data on degrees because that's where the data is. We know that that landscape is changing, so there's more apprenticeships, there's more choice of alternative qualifications at level 4 and 5 and so on. We'd like to start to capture that. The data doesn't make that necessarily that easy, but it's certainly part of our thinking that what there should be are a wider variety of routes into occupations, and we are very interested in how those routes are developing and how far they can help to improve social mobility. There's also the conventional focus, of course, on how we can improve the opportunities for those brought up in more disadvantaged environments to compete for those places in terms of elite professions and so forth. So that is an ongoing part of our area of interest. And finally, the kind of fourth bit in terms of policy that we're concerned about is that we need better data and we need better evaluation of interventions that work. The data on social mobility is complicated. There are different measures, all of which are important. And as I pointed out, there's some technicalities about absolute and relative mobility, which are important to be clear about. It's very, very important to us that we try and establish some coherence about the way in which we use data, the way in which we use that to build narratives around social mobility, because it can so easily lend itself to narratives that aren't that accurate in terms of what the data is telling us. And that it's important that we define the problem we want to fix and focus on it very, very clearly. But it's also the case that some of our data in the UK is not as good as in other countries, and we would like to see, as part of the commitment to improving social mobility, that data improved in the way we collect that. So we've written a report on that this year. We've got quite a lot of work to do to follow that through, but that report was informed by consultation with leading academics in the field, who I think would feel very would be very pleased if we could improve the quality of the data that they've got to analyse in terms of debating these issues. We also think it's important, particularly at a time when public money is going to be in short supply, that we try to focus on social mobility interventions that are both deliverable and have an evidence base in terms of impact. And so that whole question of better data and evaluation is going to be very important in terms of the work we take going forward. So using this framework and reflecting on the information we've got so far, we will in due course be accompanying a kind of policy framework paper, which will take those 4 themes a little bit further. And we've also got further reports coming out on particular themes, particularly around parental support in schools and linked to social mobility. I would view those more as think pieces, as opportunities to kind of take on a particular theme. We've done the same in terms of some podcasts that will be coming out again to debate some of those issues as we work up, move from a kind of framework for policy into more coherent policy recommendations in due course. So our aim is for this report, obviously that will be our interpretation of some of the things in this report. Other people will interpret things differently. And that is important part of the debate about social mobility. But what's really important is that we ground that debate in the evidence, and we think it's our duty as the Social Mobility Commission to provide a repository of good quality, reliable information, which is what we've set out to do in the report so far and in the Data Explorer tool. So thank you very much for being here today. I think we've got time now for some questions. I hope you found that interesting and illuminating.
Brilliant, thanks, Alan. And please do continue to put your questions in the Q&A. We've got a number of questions to get through. So I think the first one, Alan, you've talked a bit about sort of the direction of travel there, and there's a question that says about the 4 themes. So I think it's maybe could we give a bit more of flavour to what those 4 themes might look like? So the actual question is, the 4 themes seem weighted on pre-adult questions when so much of the breaks on social mobility is during adulthood. Is there a reason the SMC have weighted it that way?
I think what we tried to do is cover all of the kind of key areas that the evidence tells us, and there's a huge academic literature on this, tells us are important in terms of how do we, there's so many different things you could do, but we've got to try and group those into things that might be effective in terms of policy. So, of course, there's an important part of that is about families, early years, and performance at school. That's formative in terms of people's life chances, so that has to be part of our consideration. But I think it's also fair to say that we've got a very strong focus on post-16 as the entry into adult life, and then in terms of what the opportunity that adults have. If you look at the data in the report, we look a lot about what your opportunities are compared to where you grew up and compared to what you can achieve based on all of the different equalities groups and the geographical issues. In exploring that in more detail, I think we'll be able to pull out some more interesting and important themes, particularly around the different pathways and how they work and how effectively they work in terms of helping people get into the right kind of employment and so forth. And then the other issue, the one I started off with, is about it's about the economy, and it's about the uneven regional differences in our economy in the UK, and how far that is both the cause and the solution to some of the challenges around social mobility. So I think there's quite a lot in there about adults and about adult life. It's complicated, and we're doing our best to grapple with those things in a way that will lead to some sensible and grounded recommendations in due course.
Brilliant, thank you. And then we've got a number of questions, so I'm going to bring in colleagues on the data tool. So there's some questions around the categorizations that we've chosen and the regional aspect of it. So we know that there's 41 regions it breaks down to. So if I could ask Jackie and Rosa to talk a bit more about what the scope is for the future, but indeed why the categorizations was certain ethnic groups and not all of them. Do they come under? So for instance, Roma, Gypsy has been asked, it's been asked why that's not listed, assuming that's under other, but also someone's asked about Chester West versus Chester East. So I just wondered if you could give a bit of a flavour, Jackie, to how that was determined.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paula. Yes, as you stated, so the breakdowns provided for this year's report and data tool include 41 regions across the UK. These are broken down at what's called international territorial level 2, consistent with the ONS's breakdowns. Each of these breakdowns includes about 4 local authorities in each area that we've defined. It is our hope in future that we might be able to provide more granular breakdowns, so potentially at a lower level, at a local authority level, but for the time being, we were restricted by the sample sizes of the data available. This does provide coverage across the UK, so this includes England, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. So there is coverage not only for England, but the other nations as well. In terms of the ethnic groupings, we have included Gypsy, Roma, and Traveller when available. So for example, you'll find in our report, when we look at educational attainment, for example, Gypsy, Roma, and Traveller are included as ethnic groups there. For some of our data that we have available, we're unable to provide those groupings specifically. In some instances, yes, they are included in the other grouping. So we use what we have available depending on the data set available, and where we can, we are as granular and specific as possible.
Brilliant, thank you, Jackie. I've got a question that talks a bit more in detail, actually, Alan, asks a question a bit more in detail, and you'd mentioned about parents, and obviously all the data that Michael presented, talking about, you know, your social mobility in relation to your parents' mobility, etc. So it says the report talks about good parenting skills may also play an important role, but we currently do not have any measures to assess this. It's something we wish to investigate more in the future. Could you say a little bit more about this and what's coming up in the future and what we want to look at going forward a bit more longer term?
Okay. So if you take this particular issue, what we're trying to do in terms of the Data Explorer tool in particular and the State of the Nation report is present the data that is available. And as I pointed out, the data is not perfect. So actually, whichever way you define social mobility, you can find reasons to challenge that definition, because none of them are perfect. What we have to do with the data is see data as a kind of guide to where we might focus our attention. If we get too fixated on the detail of the data and too rigid in our thinking, then I think we're going to lose something quite important. So if you take something like parenting, how do you have a measure of that in the way that we have measures for other things like educational attainment and so on? It's very difficult to have that. But it's nevertheless really, it's well established that parenting has such a huge role to play. I mean, we have got a report coming out on this shortly. We did an evidence review last year. We've got another report coming out. We've got some work taking place on this. And particularly, the fact is that the role of families plays a significant role in the early development of children, well before they get to school, well before any public funded provision takes place. In fact, the first year, the 0 to 12 period, is particularly important in terms of development. So we want to understand better what can be done to improve provision in that respect. But it's entering into an area where we're not going to necessarily have any objective measures that says, well, parenting skills in this part of the country compared to that part of the country, or with this group compared to that group, have got a really kind of quantitative measure. But nevertheless, they're an important part of what we're doing. So we have to work through and accept that this is quite a complex terrain, and it's messy. It's not always tidy. So as we work through that, we try and come up with sensible recommendations based on the evidence we've got, and that's what we're trying to do.
Brilliant, thank you, Alan. So this question's for Alan and Michael. Michael, I might come to you first. It says the report concludes Scotland has the highest level of relative educational mobility. And that the person who's written the question says this is not fully explained. Is there more that could be learned from Scotland? And this also seems to apply to Northern Ireland. So I wonder if you can give a bit more flavour to those regions.
Okay, yeah, I can certainly do that. I mean, we need to be really clear and upfront that what this index reports on is descriptive. Okay, so we're reporting correlations and percentages and things like that. One report that gave the causal explanation for everything would have to be about 5,000 volumes long. And I'm not saying that to be facetious. It would just be a absolutely monumental task. But you've got to start somewhere, right? You have to start off with that descriptive data, and then you can start diving in and look what's driving everything, what causes everything. And that point that's just been picked up in the question obviously is very interesting. So I suppose what we're hoping is other people will observe these things and sort of take it off and look for themselves and start doing secondary work on it. And of course, that's what we will be doing in the future as well. So sorry if that wasn't quite the answer that you wanted, but yeah, I mean, I hope that clarifies it at least.
I think it explains it. That it's more of that, isn't it? People are questioning some of the things, and therefore they're explaining it. We obviously presented, one of the key findings that you presented, Michael, was about housing and home ownership. And someone's asked, given that home ownership is increasingly out of reach for most young people across large swathes of the country, how do we think this will affect social mobility going forward? I wonder, Michael, if you want to answer, and maybe you have some thoughts as well, Alan.
Yeah, sure, I can answer that. So, well, I suppose by out of reach, what we're saying is that the cost of buying a house is increasingly out of proportion with salaries. Now, what you'd expect that to mean is people would be relying more on their parents for help, either because the parents sell their house, or the children inherit a house, or something like that. And that is sort of what we're seeing in the data. You remember one of the slides that I presented had that sort of upward slope. So parental home ownership is getting better at predicting children's home ownership. And it's easy to imagine that that would be the reason, like children are relying on their parents for help in buying the house. So if your parents haven't got those means, they're not going to be able to help you. And so, yes, I think the sort of premise of the question, there is definitely something there.
Thank you. And does that have some sort of, has it been influenced by some of the previous sort of opportunities to buy years ago? We often see in stories of people who bought their local authority house and now it's worth X amount or whatever. Yeah,
sure. Okay. So this starts to get quite complicated. If we wind back the clock to the 80s, right? So we've got this policy of people having the right to buy the council house that they live in. Now, if those people's parents were renters, so we're going back like to the 80s and then back another generation. If those people's parents were mainly renters, then that right to buy policy would mean that the children of renters get to be owners, if you follow what I'm saying. So that would have improved relative mobility for that generation of people. But of course, buying a house is a one-time thing. So once the council houses are all sold, well, there aren't any more left to sell. So it could be that the relative mobility was good in that 1991 data for that reason, and it's declined because the sell-off was a one-time thing. Now, look, I'm really simplifying here just to sort of give an idea of what might be driving it, but that could explain it.
Brilliant, thank you. And sorry to have put you on the spot there.
No problem.
I think, so Alan, I'm going to ask you this, because obviously we did some work on the value of education, and Michael presented some findings about degrees. So someone's asked, how is more people going to university a good thing when a degree is often required for basic jobs, so that all that's changed is they start work with debt?
I think that's a really good question. And so, as Michael's pointed out, what we set out here is the descriptive data that is a starting point, and we've made that very public. I think it's the first time all of that data, using all the different measures and reports, into one place, so that you can see the kind of whole picture. But each individual part of that, when you delve into it, there's quite a lot of interesting questions to ask. So on this particular one, so we use the degree measure because the degree is easy to measure. Somebody else has asked earlier on, does it include a level 4 and level 5 qualifications? So that's, for those of you not part of the kind of technicality of qualifications, that's level 4 is what used to be like an HND, and level 5 and HNC, and those kind of qualifications. They're not included, no. And what's going to be interesting is if we're going to create some new alternative ways of people acquiring skills, particularly in the workplace, how will they start to be counted and measured? It's also the case that, and you can see this in some of the work we've done on value of qualifications already, that degrees still are very important in the labour market in terms of entry into some professions and in terms of the wage premium that comes back to them. But it's also the case that other qualifications also are probably less well understood. And we don't always have the data to make very straightforward comparisons. So this whole area around degrees and how they're used is very important. And lots of work, Paula, that you've led with us with employers. Employers are much more sensitive to this than they have been in the past. More employers looking at apprenticeship routes in, thinking differently about the way they assess applicants based on their existing qualifications, and how much the qualification really genuinely matters, or whether that sometimes becomes an obstacle to people in terms of opportunity. So I haven't got an easy answer to the question, or that what I'm doing is acknowledging that it's an important question to ask, and something that we're interested in.
That's great, thank you. And I think, yeah, in terms of, it ties in nicely with what work we've done, what we're showing now, and what work, the evidence, as you've talked about, and what work we've done in the past, and how we can work with communities. So in particular, the employer communities, based on that, one of those nurturing talent, the skills piece, what skills are needed in the workplace rather than necessarily qualifications. I'm afraid that is it. We are out of time. If we didn't get to your question, I do apologise. There were quite a number of questions. We've tried to answer some of them in the chat as well. What we'll do is group them together, and if you've left your if it wasn't posted anonymously, then we could get back to you if we don't feel that it has been answered so far. Just remains for me to say thank you very much to all of you for joining us this afternoon. And of course, thank you to Alan, Michael, Rosa and Jackie for their presentation. The recording will be available afterwards, as well as a PDF of the presentation that we've issued, and we would love to hear your feedback as well. And on that feedback form, there's an opportunity if you want to talk with us in more detail about anything specifically that relates to the work that you're doing, or how you might feel like you might want to use the data that we've presented, or use the data tool. So thank you very much for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at a future event.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you, everyone.